Recent history. Finally, we've made it to my own lifetime, and I definitely think it's appropriate to label this material recent history. I want to begin by touching on just a few of the highlights of recent presidential administrations. Then I want to focus more on issues in modern America. First of all, President Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 and again in 84, ushering in what was known as the Reagan Revolution. First, we need to talk about the Reagan Coalition. You still hear a lot about this today. I know in some recent Republican primaries, the candidates kept referring to the house that Reagan built. What did they mean by that? Reagan brought together a coalition of three main groups of conservatives to strengthen the Republican Party. On the one hand, there was the Values Coalition, concerned mostly with moral issues. Secondly, defense, and thirdly, the economy. Reagan was a conservative when it came to family values. He was conservative on strong national defense, and he was also a fiscal or economic conservative. He once said something to the effect that government isn't the solution to the problem, government is the problem. According to the philosophy of Reaganomics, similar to the laissez-faire economics of the 1920s, the way to stimulate the economy was to cut taxes and allow American businesses to thrive, creating more jobs and creating a trickle-down effect. The idea is that the rising tide lifts all boats. Also, during the Reagan administration, the Soviet Union was falling apart. The Cold War was warming up, as were our relations with Gorbachev. In 1988, President Bush Sr. was elected. A highlight of his administration, of course, was the Persian Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein in 1991 invaded Kuwait, and in cooperation with the United Nations, the United States liberated Kuwait from Iraq in Operation Desert Storm. Some criticized President Bush Sr. for stopping short of toppling Hussein from power, leaving him in place. Whether or not he made the right decision, as we'll see, Hussein will come back into American history soon after. Then President Clinton, a Democrat, was elected in 1992, and again in 1996. Unlike his Republican predecessors, Clinton wanted to bring back some of the social programs that had been set aside after the New Deal. Clinton had a different view of taxes, believing that government was just fine in using tax money to fund such social programs. Clinton's campaign slogan at one point was, "It's the economy, stupid." In the eyes of the Clinton campaign, the economy was the single most important issue to American voters and the issue which allowed Clinton to be elected and be so popular. His administration was also haunted by a number of scandals, for example, Whitewater, Paula Jones, Monica Lewinsky. Then George Bush Jr. was elected in 2000 and again in 2004. Some of you may remember the disputed election results in 2000 with all of the recounts in Florida. To make a long story short, the nation was very divided. Then on 9/11, with the attacks in New York City in 2001, America would never be the same. Certainly a large part of the legacy of the second Bush administration was the war on terrorism, beginning with focusing on Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and later our involvement in Iraq and the ongoing debate over that. And of course, there was the election of President Obama, a Democrat, again in 2008. This, of course, brings us into even more recent history. Obama, of course, has a more liberal view of the proper role of government in the economy, with the debate over health care reform and bank and auto industry bailouts, for example. Now let's think about some modern issues and put them in historical perspective. Modern politics is perhaps more complicated than ever before. The two major parties of the day, of course, are Republican and Democrat, and we've used those same party names ever since, well, the beginning of this course, from the Civil War onwards. But what about during the time of the Civil War? What were the parties about? What distinguished Republicans and Democrats? At that time, it was sectional, right? That was the issue. Immediately after the Civil War, it was a matter of North versus South. There was the solid red Republican North and the solid blue Democratic South. Certainly politics were sectional. But let's flash forward to the time of the Great Depression and the New Deal, the FDR years. At that time, it was more about economic philosophy, right? There was Hoover speaking for the Republicans, believing in laissez-faire. FDR, of course, was a more liberal president, believing in greater intervention of the government with the economy. Has anything changed since the FDR years? Well, the economy is still a major issue dividing Republicans and Democrats, but as I suggested before, it's become more complicated than it was back then. In our brief survey of modern issues, I want to divide it into three main categories: defense or security, the economy, and finally, moral or social issues. Let's begin with the economy. As I said, the economic differences between Republicans and Democrats have been around for a long time. Some modern issues that bring these disagreements into focus are taxation, Social Security, the healthcare system, how to reform it, NAFTA, the high price of gasoline, regulating the stock market, government bailouts, and so on. Much like before, only with changing issues, the Republicans tend to be more conservative in their view of government's role in the economy, while liberals believe in more government intervention. Well, when it comes to defense, differences between the parties today are greater than they once were. For example, with World War II, you didn't hear as much bickering between Republicans and Democrats over whether we should be fighting Germany and Japan. In more modern times, especially when it comes to conflicts in the Middle East, it is a partisan issue. I don't only want to talk about national defense. What about at a more local or even individual level? Some major issues of the day are how to deal with crime, matters of domestic defense, such as the right to carry concealed weapons, for example. An example that will hit closer to home for those of you listening is the Students for Concealed Carry movement right now, trying to convince states to pass laws allowing students with concealed carry permits to actually carry weapons on campus in order to prevent acts of violence in colleges. Prison reform, the drug problem. By the way, a great deal of the prison problem is related to drug-related charges. If someone could solve that problem, the rest of the crime problem would be much easier to solve. Then there are moral and social issues. This perhaps is the biggest difference between modern politics and politics of the past. You hear about the religious right, a coalition of conservatives focusing on issues such as abortion, gay marriage, church and state. In the past, these issues weren't as divisive between parties as they are in the current day. So I would suggest that although we are still using the same party names, Republican and Democrat, as for a long time before, there's a new party system defined by new issues added to the mix. What does this mean for both of the parties? When it comes to the Republicans, I think this mix of defense, the economy, and the newer social issues has resulted in something of a tug of war between the three legs of the old Reagan coalition. Back to the Republican primary debates that I listened to, you may have listened to as well, in one somewhat recent election, the three last men standing, McCain, Romney, and Huckabee, they seemed to represent these three parts of the Reagan coalition. It wasn't so much that they had great disagreements with one another, but they focused more on different issues. Romney, of course, focused more on the economy, Huckabee on moral issues, and McCain on national defense. So I think there's something of a tug of war over priorities that should define the Republican Party in the future. When it comes to the Democrats, I think this new party system has a great deal to do with the phenomenon of dual partisanship. Dual partisanship is where a person may vote for one party in one election and another party in a different election. This is quite common in conservative Democrat states like Kentucky was at one time, becoming more Republican in recent years. I think last time I checked, there were about twice as many registered Democrats in Kentucky as Republicans. That's hard to imagine here in the Southeast 5th District because of the great Republican majority in this region, but overall, in recent years, there was a Democratic majority. However, the higher up you go towards the presidency at the national level, Kentuckians in recent years have tended to elect Republicans. Very often, we vote for Republican presidents, senators, U.S. congressmen, and in recent years, there has even been a Republican majority in the state Senate. But as you go farther down, for example, the House of Representatives in Frankfort, until very recently, there's always been a Democratic majority. What's going on there with dual partisanship? I think it has a lot to do with this set of moral and social issues. In places like Kentucky, when you talk about issues like the Second Amendment or abortion or gay rights, I think the majority of voters feel that at the national level, the Democratic Party has distanced itself from their values. Yet when it comes to economic issues, they still tend to vote Democrat much of the time. So a candidate at the national level, like Barack Obama, is probably not going to be campaigning in quite the same way as a rural Kentucky Democrat running for the state legislature. They will focus on different issues. All of these issues in the modern day complicate simple labels like conservative and liberal, or right and left. Because when you ask if someone is liberal or conservative, you need to ask yourself, well, in what issue? Social, fiscal, military? If you were to chart someone as a liberal or conservative, right or left, at first you might think of this as a linear chart. The farther you are to the left, the more liberal. The farther to the right, the more conservative. But I want you to think of it in terms of more dimensions. I've attached an illustration to help get this point across. I once saw on the internet a quiz where you would answer questions about all sorts of modern issues, social, fiscal, defense. It would chart you on not a one-dimensional but a two-dimensional chart from side to side and from top to bottom, depending on where you were on certain types of issues. When you take a look at that chart, I want you to consider various examples of famous politicians and where they might fit on such a chart. For example, Barack Obama. Socially, he's a liberal. Economically, he's a liberal. So where would he fall on the chart? What about, say, Mike Huckabee? I think he would fall on the conservative end, both as a social issue conservative and also with economic issues. But what about someone like Rudy Giuliani? Rudy Giuliani is a Republican and he's an economic conservative. However, he has a liberal position on a number of social issues. Where would he lie on the chart? Finally, what about a conservative Democrat like Zell Miller? He has identified with the Democratic Party for years. Think about the traditional meeting of the Democratic Party and the economic focus. But when it comes to many social issues, he has shown himself to be a conservative. Where would he be on the chart? Finally, let's make this a little more complicated, yet closer to reality, and picture a three-dimensional chart. What would the third dimension be? I think priority has a lot to do with this. I took this quiz I referred to, and it told me which candidate I most closely identified with. I was surprised because it wasn't my favorite candidate, and I was thinking, well, what's going on here? I believe it probably had to do with priority. We might agree with a certain candidate on a majority of issues, but on a few issues that are the most important to us, we may disagree and therefore support a different candidate. So if I were to chart myself, I think I would prioritize issues that deal with the family because of the many ways in which that affects other issues. Think about it. Strengthening American families would help with, well, the economy, crime, violence, drugs, you name it. Finally, there's one other illustration. Actually, a series of maps I want you to consider that illustrate a trend towards rural versus urban areas. Rural and urban partisanism. You've heard of red states and blue states. Red meaning they go for Republican presidential candidates, and blue states going for Democrats. If you look at a map of the nation, you can see a very divided nation, but the closer you look, the even more divided the nation is. Most states, instead of being overwhelmingly red or blue, are actually fairly close within themselves. So look at some maps that show purple states. The stronger the red or blue, the more overwhelming the majority is. But if it's purple, it's a fairly close race. It's also revealing to look at more detailed county by county maps. You'll see that in terms of land area, the country is mostly red. Most counties go for Republican presidential candidates these days. On the other hand, the blue places you'll find in these more detailed maps tend to be large cities. You can look at some two-dimensional maps that reflect population density and see that there are big, tall blue skyscrapers in large stretches of red. This reflects that there is a trend toward greater support for Democrats in urban areas and support for Republicans in rural areas. Finally, I'd like to end the semester by encouraging you to be an active, informed, responsible participant in making your own history. I believe in service learning. I believe that you should apply historical insight to making a difference in the modern world. So I encourage you to take some things you've learned in this class into real life with you, whether you're concerned about promoting economic growth or involvement in a civil rights movement, for example, the Right to Life movement, if you're interested in coming up with the perfect solution to the healthcare crisis, or if you're interested in gun control issues. Whatever is important to you, take what you've learned and make the world a better place.